What if I told you that one of the most detailed descriptions of a man's death in history was written 700 years before he was born? What if that description didn't come from a witness, a historian, or a follower, but from an ancient prophet living in a completely different world? And what if this single chapter quietly holds the key to understanding suffering, sacrifice, and salvation itself? This is not a legend. This is Isaiah 53. To understand why this chapter is so unsettling, we have to travel back in time, long before Rome, long before crucifixion, long before the name Jesus was ever spoken. The prophet Isaiah lived around 740 BC in Jerusalem. His world was collapsing, empires were rising. Assyria was swallowing nations whole, and Judah stood trembling in its shadow. Corruption filled the courts, injustice filled the streets, and fear filled the hearts of the people. It was in this moment of national anxiety that Isaiah received a vision that would define his life. Inside the temple, he saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and lifted up. Overwhelmed by holiness and his own unworthiness, Isaiah expected judgment. Instead, he was cleansed, forgiven, and sent. For over 40 years, he spoke messages no one wanted to hear, warnings of judgment, calls to repentance, and promises of a future hope that seemed impossible. Among all his prophecies, one theme kept returning like a quiet drumbeat: the servant of the Lord. At first, the servant sounded hopeful, chosen by God, filled with the Spirit, bringing justice not just to Israel, but to the nations. Gentle, patient, faithful. But as Isaiah continued, the picture began to darken. This servant would be rejected, despised, misunderstood, not a conquering king, not a political liberator, not the hero Israel expected. And then Isaiah writes words that stop time itself. He describes a man with no beauty that people should desire him, a man acquainted with grief, familiar with sorrow, someone people would turn their faces away from, someone considered cursed by God. But the most shocking part isn't the suffering, it's the reason for it. Isaiah says this servant would suffer not for his own crimes, but for the sins of others, that he would be wounded for their transgressions, crushed for their iniquities, that the punishment bringing peace to others would fall on him. And then come the details that make scholars pause. The servant is described as being pierced, silent before his accusers, led away unjustly, cut off from the land of the living. In Isaiah's time, crucifixion did not exist. It wouldn't be invented for centuries. Yet the language points unmistakably toward a violent public execution designed to cause prolonged suffering. Even more disturbing, Isaiah says the servant would die like a criminal, yet be buried with the rich. A contradiction on purpose, a detail too specific to ignore. For generations, Jewish readers struggled with this chapter. Who is this servant? Is it Israel itself, a righteous remnant, a future prophet? The questions never went away. But Isaiah wasn't finished. He says that after death, this servant would somehow see life again, that he would prolong his days, that he would see the results of his suffering and be satisfied, that God himself would exalt him. Death, followed by life. Humiliation, followed by glory. Silence, followed by victory. Isaiah 53 does not read like poetry. It reads like a case file, calm, precise, unemotional, as if the prophet is describing something he has already seen. And that raises a terrifying question. How could a man living 7 centuries before Christ describe with such clarity the suffering, death, purpose, and vindication of one individual? If this chapter is truly prophetic, then it means history is not random. It means suffering may have meaning. And it means salvation was never an accident. Because Isaiah 53 doesn't ask us whether suffering exists. It asks us, who suffered and why? And that question changes everything. If Isaiah 53 were read in isolation, it would already feel unsettling. But when placed inside the expectations of its time, it becomes almost scandalous. Israel was not waiting for a suffering servant. They were waiting for a victor. For centuries, the Jewish people had lived under foreign domination: Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and later Romans. Their scriptures spoke of a Messiah, an anointed one, a king from the line of David who would restore the throne, crush enemies, and bring freedom. The hope was national, political, and visible. So when Isaiah described a figure who would be rejected instead of celebrated, wounded instead of crowned, silent instead of triumphant, it felt wrong. This servant didn't overthrow oppressors. He absorbed pain, Isaiah says people would look at him and see nothing worth admiring. No royal presence, no commanding appearance, no obvious sign of divine favor. Instead, they would see weakness, suffering, shame. And in the ancient world, suffering carried a dangerous assumption. If you suffer, you must deserve it. That's why Isaiah makes a startling clarification. He says the people would assume the servant was being punished by God, stricken, smitten, afflicted. But that assumption would be completely false. The suffering was not judgment, it was substitution. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Isaiah repeats the point again and again, as if anticipating resistance. This pain was not accidental. It was not symbolic. It was intentional and personal. The servant was carrying something that did not belong to him. This idea was not new to Israel. The entire sacrificial system was built on substitution. An innocent animal would die in place of a guilty person. Blood would be shed so that guilt could be covered. Life exchanged for life. But Isaiah goes further than the temple ever dared. The servant is not bringing a sacrifice. He is the sacrifice. He is led like a lamb to the slaughter. Silent, willing, not resisting, not defending himself. This is not weakness, it is control. The servant chooses the path of suffering. Then Isaiah delivers one of the most chilling lines in the entire chapter. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. Not because God delights in pain, but because this suffering would accomplish something no ritual ever could. It would deal with sin at its root. And then comes another impossible detail. Isaiah says the servant would be assigned a grave with the wicked, yet be with a rich man in his death. How can both be true? Executed like a criminal, yet buried with honor. This is not vague poetry. It's a paradox waiting for history to catch up. Isaiah continues. The servant would be cut off from the land of the living, language that clearly speaks of death. But death is not the end of the story. After suffering, the servant would see life. He would prolong his days. He would see the fruit of his anguish and be satisfied. In other words, the servant dies, and then somehow lives again. For ancient readers, this made no sense. Resurrection was not a category they applied to the Messiah. A dead deliverer was a failed deliverer. A suffering Messiah was a contradiction. And that is precisely why Isaiah 53 was so dangerous. It refused to fit expectations. It refused to flatter national pride. It refused to offer an easy victory. Instead, it pointed toward a deeper problem than political oppression, human sin, and a deeper solution than military power, self-giving love. This servant would not save by taking lives. He would save by giving his own. And Isaiah makes one final claim that pushes the chapter beyond Israel entirely. The servant's work would affect many nations. Kings would be silenced. People who had never heard would understand. This was not a local rescue mission. It was global. At this point, the prophecy hangs in the air unanswered. No name, no date, no explanation. No go, just a question echoing through the centuries. Who is this servant, and when will he come? That question remained open for 700 years. Until one day in a dusty province under Roman rule, a man appeared with no political power, no army, no throne, and yet spoke with authority no one could explain. And the ancient words of Isaiah suddenly felt uncomfortably close. 700 years after Isaiah wrote those words, the world looked nothing like his own, and yet in all the ways that mattered, it was the same. Empires still ruled. Fear still shaped daily life. Injustice still walked openly through the streets. This time the empire was Rome. Into this occupied land, a child was born with no palace, no army, and no political strategy. He grew up in obscurity far from centers of power. No royal education, no public platform. Nothing about his life suggested destiny. And yet when he began to speak, people listened. Jesus of Nazareth did not match the image of a conquering Messiah. He did not call for revolt. He did not gather weapons. Instead, he spoke of hearts, repentance, forgiveness, and a kingdom not of this world. He touched lepers. He ate with sinners. He welcomed the rejected. To many, this was confusing. To others, dangerous. The religious leaders watched him closely. They knew the scriptures. They knew Isaiah. And they sensed that something about this man threatened the systems they controlled. He spoke with authority not borrowed from tradition, but flowing from within. He claimed to forgive sins, something only God could do. Still, even his closest followers struggled to understand him. When he spoke of suffering, they resisted. When he warned of rejection, they denied it. When he mentioned death, they didn't listen. They wanted the crown without the cross. Then in one quiet evening, everything changed. Jesus was betrayed by one of his own, arrested under cover of darkness, taken through a series of rushed trials, first before religious authorities, then before Roman officials. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Accusations piled up, but evidence was thin. And just as Isaiah had written, he did not defend himself. Before his accusers, he remained largely silent. No speeches, no protests, no attempt to save himself. Power restrained itself. To the crowds, this silence looked like weakness. To Rome, it looked like guilt. To the religious leaders, it was convenient. He was sentenced to death. Roman execution was not designed to be quick. It was designed to break the body and humiliate the soul. Jesus was beaten, flogged, mocked, and crowned with thorns. His back torn open, his face disfigured beyond recognition. Isaiah's words echoed without mercy. His appearance was marred beyond human likeness. Then came the cross, nails driven through flesh, arms stretched wide, breath becoming a battle. Hours of agony beneath an indifferent sky. Above his head, a sign declared his crime, King of the Jews. Mocked by soldiers, ridiculed by passers-by, abandoned by most of his followers. He hung between criminals counted among the guilty, just as Isaiah had written. And yet, in the midst of suffering, he spoke words that reframed everything. Father, forgive them. This was not rage. This was intention. As his strength faded, the unthinkable happened. Darkness fell, the earth shook, and Jesus cried out before breathing his last. At that moment, the temple curtain, thick, massive, separating humanity from the holy presence of God, was torn from top to bottom. Not by human hands. From above, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Access had been opened, a barrier removed, a sacrifice accepted. But the strangest detail came afterward. Though executed like a criminal, Jesus was not thrown into a common grave. Instead, a wealthy member of the council, Joseph of Arimathea, asked for his body. He was placed in a new tomb carved from rock wrapped in costly burial spices. Executed with the wicked, buried with the rich. Isaiah had written it centuries earlier. Still, the story should have ended there. A dead Messiah was no Messiah at all. The disciples scattered. Hope collapsed. Fear took over. Everything they thought they understood lay sealed behind a stone. And if Isaiah 53 ended at death, it would have remained a tragedy. But it didn't. Isaiah said, "The servant would see life again, and on the third day the tomb was empty." At dawn on the third day, the world did not stop turning. Rome still ruled. Soldiers still guarded the streets. The cross still stood as a warning. Nothing about that morning suggested a revolution, except for one thing. The tomb was empty. The first witnesses were not generals or priests. They were women grieving, exhausted, coming to finish burial rituals for a man they believed was gone forever. The stone that should have sealed death was rolled away. The body they expected to find was missing. At first, they assumed the unthinkable had happened. Grave robbers, a mistake, anything except resurrection. But then came the encounters. Jesus did not return as a vision or a memory. He spoke, he walked, he was touched, he ate. The same man who had been crucified now stood alive, bearing the marks of nails and spear. Fear turned into disbelief. Disbelief turned into joy. Joy turned into awe. Over the following weeks, he appeared not only to individuals, but to groups, to the disciples behind locked doors, to travelers on the road, to more than 500 people at once. These were not mystical experiences shared by a few. They were repeated physical encounters that demanded explanation. The resurrection did not create faith, it forced a decision. Either the greatest fraud in history had occurred, or Isaiah 53 had just stepped out of the scroll and into reality. Because Isaiah had said the servant would be cut off from the land of the living and then somehow prolong his days, that he would see the outcome of his suffering and be satisfied. A dead man cannot be satisfied. A reason one can. Suddenly, everything made sense. The silence before accusers, the willing surrender, the substitutionary suffering. This was not defeat. This was design. The early followers of Jesus did something no defeated movement ever does. They didn't hide. They didn't rewrite the story to avoid embarrassment. They didn't deny the cross. They preached it. They declared that the shameful death was the plan all along, that the cross was not a mistake to be explained away, but the center of God's rescue mission. And when they needed to explain it, they turned again and again to one chapter. Isaiah 53. Peter told crowds that Jesus bore our sins in his body. Paul wrote that the sinless one became sin for us. The author of Hebrews declared that one sacrifice had done what centuries of offerings never could. The language was different, but the idea was the same. Substitution. Point 2. He took what we deserved, so we could receive what he deserved. And this message didn't stay in Jerusalem. One of the most striking moments happened on a desert road. An Ethiopian official, powerful, educated, searching, was reading from Isaiah out loud. He stopped at chapter 53. Confused, he asked a simple question. Who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else? Philip, a follower of Jesus, began with that very passage. And by the end of the conversation, the official believed. He was baptized on the spot and carried the message back to Africa. Isaiah 53 had crossed borders. What made this chapter so powerful was not clever argument. It was clarity. It named the human problem, sin, guilt, brokenness, and offered a solution rooted in grace rather than effort. No ladder to climb, no merit to earn, no ritual to repeat endlessly. The work was finished. And then came a moment heavy with symbolism. When Jesus died, the temple curtain tore. Within a generation, the temple itself would be destroyed. The sacrificial system central to Jewish worship came to an end. No more daily offerings, no more blood on the altar, not because God abandoned his people, but because the final sacrifice had already been made. Isaiah's servant had done what no priest ever could. He did not merely cover sin, he removed it. When time, and that changes the way suffering itself is understood. Isaiah 53 does not promise a life without pain, but it reveals a God who does not watch suffering from a distance. He enters it, carries it, redeems it, which leads to a question far more personal than prophecy. If the servant truly bore our guilt, if the price has already been paid, then what remains is not fear but response. Because resurrection does not just prove the prophecy true, it demands an answer. If Isaiah 53 were merely a poetic reflection, it would have faded into history long ago. But it didn't. Instead, it became one of the most debated, examined, and controversial passages ever written. Not because it is unclear, but because of what it seems to point toward. From the earliest centuries, people have asked the same question. Who is the servant? Within Jewish tradition, many later interpretations identified the servant as Israel itself, a nation suffering among the nations. On the surface, this seems plausible. Israel had endured exile, oppression, and rejection. But the chapter resists that explanation at every turn. The servant in Isaiah 53 is described as innocent yet suffering for the guilt of others. Israel, by Isaiah's own words earlier in the book, is not innocent. The servant suffers voluntarily. Israel's suffering comes as judgment. The servant dies for others. Israel is the one needing redemption. The grammar itself points to an individual, not a collective. He is singular, personal, distinct. A he, not a they. And then there is the issue of death and resurrection. Isaiah says the servant is cut off from the land of the living, clearly dying, and yet afterward sees life and prolongs his days. Nations do not die and rise again in this way. Individuals do. This is why Isaiah 53 remained unsettling. It refused to settle into any safe category. For early Christians, the connection was unavoidable. They didn't search for a prophecy to fit Jesus. They found a prophecy that already described him. Too precisely, too thoroughly. And history adds another layer. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the 20th century contain copies of Isaiah written before the time of Jesus. Isaiah 53 is there unchanged. The chapter was not edited after the fact. It existed long before crucifixion, long before Christianity, long before the cross became a symbol. This means the question is not whether the text was altered. The question is whether it was fulfilled. Even medical science has weighed in. Modern analysis of crucifixion explains how victims struggled to breathe, how the body collapsed under its own weight, how prolonged exposure caused shock and asphyxiation. Isaiah's descriptions, pierced, crushed, disfigured, match the reality with unsettling accuracy. But beyond debate and evidence lies something deeper. Isaiah 53 confronts the human instinct to earn salvation. It dismantles the idea that goodness is enough. The servant does not come to show us how to try harder. He comes to do what we cannot do for ourselves. This is why the message spread so quickly across cultures. From Jerusalem to Rome, from Africa to Asia, across languages, empires, and centuries. Because guilt is universal. And so is the longing to be forgiven. Isaiah 53 offers a solution that does not depend on background education or moral resume. It speaks to the broken, the ashamed, the weary, those who know something is wrong but don't know how to fix it. The servant bears what we fear facing, the judgment, the separation, the weight of failure. And in exchange, he offers peace, not the absence of struggle, but reconciliation with God. This is why the chapter ends not in grief but in triumph. The servant is exalted. He is given a portion among the great. His suffering is not wasted. It accomplishes exactly what it was meant to do. Which brings us to the final question. Isaiah 53 does not force belief. It invites reflection. It leaves room for doubt but not indifference. If this chapter truly describes Jesus, then his death was not a tragedy. It was the turning point of history. If it does not, then we are left with one of the most extraordinary coincidences ever recorded. But either way, the question remains personal. If someone truly suffered in your place, if the debt has already been paid, if peace is offered as a gift, what will you do with it? Because prophecy is not just about knowing the future. Sometimes it is about confronting the present. For the followers of Jesus, the third day began with grief, not expectation. They were not waiting for a miracle. They were preparing spices. Early that Sunday morning, several women walked toward the tomb where Jesus had been laid. The stone was heavy. The guards were Roman. The finality of death felt absolute. Whatever hope they once carried had been sealed away with the body. But when they arrived, nothing was where it should have been. The ground had shaken. The stone was rolled aside. The tomb was open. And inside, there was no body. At first, confusion overwhelmed fear. Grave robbery was the only explanation that made sense. No one expected resurrection, not even those who loved him most. Then came the message that changed everything. Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen. These words were not spoken to theologians or leaders, but to grieving women, unexpected witnesses, in a culture that rarely trusted their testimony. Yet history would hinge on what they saw. Jesus was alive. Not as a symbol, not as a memory, not as a vision. Alive. He spoke Mary's name and she recognized his voice. Familiar, personal, undeniable. She ran to tell the others, but disbelief spread faster than hope. Resurrection sounded like madness. Later that same day, 2 disciples walked the road to Emmaus discussing the events in hushed disappointment. A stranger joined them, explaining the scriptures starting with Moses moving through the prophets, including Isaiah. Only when he broke bread did their eyes open. And then he vanished. That evening, Jesus appeared to the disciples gathered behind locked doors. Fear filled the room until he spoke. "Peace be with you." He showed them his hands, his side. The wounds were still there, but death no longer ruled them. This was not a replacement body. This was the same Jesus transformed. Still, not everyone believed. Thomas demanded proof. A week later, Jesus returned and offered exactly that. No rebuke, no anger, just an invitation. Put your finger here. Do not doubt, but believe. Thomas's response echoed across centuries. My Lord and my God. Isaiah had written that the servant would pour out his soul to death and yet prolong his days. This was not poetic language anymore. It was history unfolding. The resurrection did more than prove Jesus was alive. It redefined everything. If Jesus rose from the dead, then his death was not defeat, it was payment. If he rose, then sin had been dealt with. If he rose, then Isaiah 53 was not metaphor, it was fulfillment. Over the next 40 days, Jesus appeared repeatedly, to individuals, to groups, to more than 500 people at once. He ate with them, taught them, let them touch him. Hallucinations don't eat. Legends don't leave empty tombs. Myths don't transform cowards into witnesses willing to die. These men and women did not preach a philosophy. They proclaimed an event. We have seen him, and they were willing to suffer for that claim. But the resurrection was not the end of the servant's work. It was the beginning of its effect. Before ascending, Jesus told his followers to wait. Something was coming. Power, purpose, a mission that would stretch far beyond Jerusalem. And it did. Within weeks, thousands believed. Within decades, the message spread throughout the Roman Empire. Within centuries, it reached the edges of the known world, not by force, not by politics, but by testimony. Isaiah had written that the servant would justify many and bear their iniquities. Now people from every background, Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, educated and illiterate, were finding forgiveness through him. And something else happened. The sacrificial system ended. No more lambs, no more daily offerings, no more blood on the altar, because the final sacrifice had been made. When Jesus died, the temple curtain tore. When he rose, the meaning became clear. Access to God was no longer limited to one place or one priest. It was open to all who came through the servant. Isaiah 53 had predicted not just suffering, but success. Not just death, but victory. The resurrection was heaven's confirmation. The price was accepted. The debt was canceled. The work was finished. Yet one question remained. If death itself could not hold him, what does that mean for those who trust him? And that question would change how millions understood life, suffering, forgiveness, and hope itself. The resurrection answered the question of power. But it raised another deeper question of meaning. Why did Jesus have to suffer at all? If he could calm storms, heal the sick, and raise the dead, why didn't he stop the nails? Why allow the cross when escape was always within reach? Isaiah 53 gives the answer in a single unsettling idea: substitution. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him. This was not accidental suffering. It was intentional exchange. The early followers of Jesus did not invent this interpretation. They inherited it directly from Isaiah's language. Peter, once fearful and broken, later wrote with clarity and conviction. He said Jesus bore our sins in his body on the tree. Not symbolically, not metaphorically. Actually, Paul took the same idea and expressed it with stunning simplicity. He who knew no sin became sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. This is the heart of the gospel, not improvement but replacement. Jesus did not come to make bad people slightly better. He came to stand in their place, to take what they deserved and give them what they could never earn. Every culture understands exchange, payment, substitution, someone stepping in so another can go free. Isaiah 53 takes that universal instinct and reveals its ultimate form. The servant suffers not for his own failure but for ours. He carries guilt that is not his. He absorbs judgment meant for others. And in return, those others receive peace. This is why the cross stands at the center of Christianity, not as a moral example alone, but as a transaction. A ransom paid, a debt settled. Jesus himself said it plainly. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. A ransom implies captivity, bondage, inability to free oneself. Isaiah had already diagnosed the problem. All we like sheep have gone astray. Not some, all. The image is deliberate. Sheep don't rebel with strategy. They wander slowly, carelessly, until they are lost. Humanity, Isaiah says, didn't fall because it tried too hard to be evil. It fell because it went its own way, and the cost of that wandering was placed on the servant. This idea shattered ancient assumptions. Religion had always been about sent humans reaching upward through sacrifice, effort, and obedience. Isaiah 53 reversed the direction. God came down. Instead of humanity climbing toward holiness, holiness stepped into humanity's suffering. Instead of people offering sacrifices to God, God offered himself. This is why early Christians stopped bringing animals to altars. Why temples lost their central role. Why forgiveness was no longer tied to geography or ritual. The sacrifice had already been made. Once, fully, sufficiently. The book of Hebrews explained it this way. Priests stood daily offering repeated sacrifices that could never remove sin. But Jesus offered one sacrifice for all time and then sat down. Sitting down meant the work was finished. Nothing left to add, nothing left to prove. This changed how people related to God. No longer through fear of failing, no longer through constant self-measurement, but through trust. Faith was no longer a performance. It became a response. Isaiah 53 made it clear the servant accomplished what we could not. Salvation was not achieved, it was received. This didn't lead to moral laziness. It led to transformation. People who knew they were forgiven stopped living to earn approval and started living from gratitude. Good works didn't disappear. They followed, not as currency, but as fruit. This is why the message spread so rapidly among the broken and burdened. Slaves, outcasts, the ashamed, those crushed by the weight of never being enough. Isaiah 53 told them the truth they had never heard. You are not saved because you succeed. You are saved because another took your place. And that truth still confronts every listener today. If Jesus truly carried what you carry, if the judgment has already fallen, if peace has already been purchased, then the question is no longer, what must I do? It becomes something far more personal. Will I trust what has already been done? Once the idea of substitution took hold, everything else began to change. For centuries, people had approached God with uncertainty. Had they done enough? Had they failed too much? Was forgiveness temporary, fragile, always at risk of being lost again? Isaiah 53 shattered that anxiety. If the servant truly bore sin, then sin was no longer hovering unresolved. If the punishment had already fallen, then peace was not a future hope, it was a present reality. If righteousness was given not earned, then acceptance no longer depended on performance. This was revolutionary. Paul understood the implications immediately. Writing to the Romans, he declared that all had sinned and fallen short, but were justified freely as a gift through redemption in Christ. The word gift mattered. You don't negotiate for a gift. You don't improve yourself to deserve it. You either receive it or reject it. Isaiah 53 made that logic unavoidable. If the servant carried everything, then nothing remained to be paid. If the debt was settled, then guilt no longer had legal authority. If God himself provided the sacrifice, then fear lost its grip. This is where freedom began. Not freedom from struggle, but freedom from condemnation. Many people confuse Christianity with moral pressure. But Isaiah 53 reveals something different. It does not start by telling people how to live. It starts by telling them what has already been done for them. Only after that does transformation follow. Paul explained this clearly to the Ephesians. Salvation comes by grace through faith, not by works, so that no one can boast. And then he added something crucial. Believers are created for good works prepared beforehand. Works were not the entrance. They were the result. Isaiah 53 established the order. First substitution, then peace, then a changed life. This freed people from two extremes. On one side was pride, the belief that moral achievement earns favor. Isaiah crushed that illusion by declaring that all had gone astray. No one qualified on their own. On the other side was despair, the fear that failure disqualifies permanently. Isaiah crushed that fear by declaring that the servant bore all iniquity. Nothing was left out. This is why the chapter remains so personal. It doesn't speak in abstractions. It talks about wounds, guilt, healing, peace, real experiences, real burdens. And it explains why religious effort alone never satisfies. Rules can restrain behavior, but they cannot erase guilt. Rituals can manage conscience, but they cannot heal it. Only substitution can. When someone truly grasps Isaiah 53, the inner conversation changes. The voice that constantly accuses, "You're not enough, you've failed again, you'll never measure up," loses authority. Not because failure disappears, but because judgment has already been carried. This does not lead to careless living. It leads to honest living. People stop pretending, stop hiding, stop bargaining with God. They approach him as children, not employees. This also reframes suffering. Isaiah called the servant a man of sorrows acquainted with grief. That meant God did not observe pain from a distance. He entered it. Betrayal, injustice, physical agony, emotional abandonment. For those who suffer, this matters deeply. It means pain is not proof of rejection. It means grief is not evidence of abandonment. It means God understands suffering from the inside. The cross does not explain every reason for pain, but it proves God is not indifferent to it. This is why Isaiah 53 has comforted people in hospital rooms, prison cells, war zones, and gravesites. It tells them they are not alone, that their suffering has been seen, carried, and redeemed. And there is more. The chapter does not end with the servant broken. It ends with him exalted, satisfied, victorious. His suffering accomplishes its purpose. That means pain is not final. Failure is not fatal. Death is not ultimate. The servant lives, and because he lives, those who trust him are not defined by their past, their shame, or their worst moment. They are defined by what was placed on him and what he placed on them in return. Isaiah 53 doesn't just change theology, it changes identity. Isaiah 53 is right plain. You are no longer someone trying to earn acceptance. You are someone living from it. And once that truth settles in, freedom begins not as a feeling, but as a foundation that nothing else can replace. If Isaiah 53 were bound to one culture, it would have stayed there. But it didn't. Instead, it traveled farther, faster, and deeper than anyone could have predicted. Long before Christianity held political power, long before churches filled cities, this chapter crossed borders carried only by words and conviction. One of the earliest examples happened on a desert road. An Ethiopian official treasurer to a queen was returning home from Jerusalem. He was educated, powerful, and searching. Sitting in his chariot, he read from a scroll Isaiah 53. The words were clear, but their meaning was not. Who is the prophet talking about, he asked. Himself or someone else? That question has echoed through history. God sent Philip to that road at that exact moment. Beginning with Isaiah 53, Philip explained the good news about Jesus. No philosophy, no pressure, just fulfillment. The Ethiopian believed immediately. He was baptized on the spot and carried the message back to Africa. Church tradition says Christianity took root there earlier than almost anywhere else outside Israel. All of it began with Isaiah 53. As centuries passed, missionaries discovered the same thing. This chapter spoke across cultures because it addressed universal human experience. In India, William Carey used Isaiah 53 to explain substitution to people shaped by karma. The idea that someone else could bear consequences broke the cycle of endless moral accounting. In Burma Adoniram, Judson found that the servant's suffering resonated with Buddhist concepts of pain, but went further, offering redemption rather than escape. In China, Hudson Taylor showed Confucian scholars the logical flow of Isaiah 53 guilt sacrifice, peace restoration. It made sense in a way abstract religion did not. Across Africa, translators noticed how naturally the image of a lamb sacrifice connected with tribal traditions where one life was offered for another. Isaiah 53 worked everywhere because it spoke to what everyone knows but rarely admits. We are not who we should be. Something is broken. Guilt is real. And we need reconciliation. Every culture develops rituals to deal with this. Offerings, acts of penance, moral striving. But Isaiah 53 declares that the final solution came not from humanity upward, but from God downward. This is why the chapter remains central to Bible translation efforts today. Organizations working among unreached people groups consistently identify Isaiah 53 as one of the most powerful passages to translate accurately. When people hear it in their own language, questions follow almost immediately. Who is this servant? Why does he suffer? How can his pain bring peace? The clarity is unsettling. Isaiah does not describe vague suffering. He describes this kind of suffering: piercing, crushing, silence under accusation, death followed by life. These details anchor the message in history. Archaeology has only strengthened this. The discovery of a first-century crucified man near Jerusalem confirmed how Roman execution worked nails through heels, bodies contorted for breath. Isaiah's language aligns with physical reality centuries before crucifixion was practiced. Medical analysis adds another layer. Doctors note how crucifixion caused extreme trauma, swelling, dehydration, and disfigurement, matching Isaiah's description of a figure marred beyond recognition. Even the detail of blood and water flowing from Jesus' side, aligns with modern understanding of cardiac trauma. Isaiah didn't know anatomy. He didn't know Roman methods, but he described the outcome with precision. Still, the global impact of Isaiah 53 is not driven by evidence alone. It is driven by hope. People do not cross deserts, oceans, and empires for abstract arguments. They do so because they have found something worth living and dying for. Isaiah 53 offers what every culture seeks: a way to be made right, without pretending, without hiding, without endless striving. It says guilt can be removed, peace can be real, healing is possible. Not because humans succeed, but because the servant did. This is why the chapter refuses to fade. Empires rise and fall, philosophies change. But Isaiah 53 continues to speak, asking the same question in every language to every generation. Who is the servant? And if he truly carried the weight of the world, what does that mean for you? Isaiah 53 did not just inspire belief. It provoked resistance. As Christianity spread, this single chapter became the fault line between two worldviews, reading the same scriptures and arriving at radically different conclusions. The debate was not minor. It went to the core of identity, faith, and history itself. For Jewish readers, especially after the first century, Isaiah 53 began to be interpreted differently. The servant, many taught, represented the nation of Israel, suffering among the nations, bearing injustice, misunderstood by the world. This interpretation did not appear out of nowhere. Israel had suffered deeply. Exile, persecution, scattering. Pain shaped its story. Reading Isaiah 53 collectively offered meaning to centuries of hardship. But the shift also had another motivation. If Isaiah 53 described Jesus, then the implications were unavoidable. It meant the Messiah had already come. It meant the cross was not a scandal, but the plan. It meant Christianity's central claim stood on Jewish scripture itself. That was a conclusion many could not accept. Earlier Jewish writings, however, tell a more complex story. Some ancient rabbis did interpret Isaiah 53 as messianic. Certain Targums paraphrase the chapter with explicit references to the Messiah. The idea was not foreign, it was debated. But as the divide between Judaism and Christianity widened, interpretations hardened. Isaiah 53 became contested ground. The language itself fueled the tension. The servant is innocent yet suffers for others. He dies yet lives again. He bears sin yet justifies many. These details strain a national interpretation. Nations sin. Nations need forgiveness. Nations do not die for others' guilt and then rise to justify them. Christians argued that the chapter reads like biography, not metaphor. An individual life, a specific sequence, a clear outcome. The debate intensified in medieval times. Jewish and Christian scholars faced one another in public disputations, analyzing every phrase. Both sides wrote extensive commentaries. Both claimed faithfulness to the text. Yet one reality remained undeniable. Isaiah 53 would not stay neutral. Remove it and Christianity loses its strongest prophetic foundation. Interpret it messianically and Jesus fits with unsettling precision. This is why the chapter was sometimes avoided in synagogue readings. Not erased, but sidelined. Its power lay in what it seemed to say too clearly. The New Testament writers did not hesitate. They quoted Isaiah 53 directly, repeatedly, openly. They framed Jesus' death through its language of substitution, silence, sacrifice, and victory. They were not subtle about it. Philip told the Ethiopian official the good news of Jesus starting from Isaiah 53. Peter echoed its phrases when describing the cross. Paul built his theology of justification on its logic. This was not coincidence. It was continuity. Isaiah 53 was not an isolated poem. It was the climax of a larger story, a sacrificial system that never fully removed sin, pointing forward to something greater. The book of Hebrews explained this with brutal clarity. If animal sacrifices truly worked, they would have stopped. Instead, they continued year after year, reminding people of sin rather than removing it. Isaiah 53 predicted the end of that system, and history confirmed it. In 70 AD, Jerusalem fell. The temple was destroyed. The altar was gone. Sacrifices ceased. For nearly 2,000 years, they have not returned. The question remained, how are sins dealt with now? Christianity answered through the servant, who offered himself once for all. Judaism continued to emphasize repentance, prayer, and obedience in the absence of the temple. Two paths, one scripture, one unresolved question. Was Isaiah 53 describing a nation or a person? The debate is not academic. It shapes how one approaches God, through ongoing effort or through completed sacrifice. Isaiah 53 stands between those approaches like a mirror, reflecting different conclusions depending on what one is willing to see. And perhaps that is why the chapter remains so unsettling. It does not allow easy neutrality. It presses the reader toward a decision. Either the servant bore the weight of sin and changed everything, or he didn't, and the chapter remains an unresolved mystery. History has been shaped by how people answer that question, and it still is. Isaiah 53 is not only debated in classrooms and synagogues. It is read in quiet rooms, hospital beds, prison cells, moments where theory collapses and only truth remains. Because at its core, this chapter speaks directly to pain. Not abstract suffering, but the kind that leaves marks. Betrayal by someone trusted. Accusations that cannot be undone. Loneliness that feels heavier at night. Guilt that returns no matter how much time passes. Isaiah did not write about a distant hero. He described a man of sorrows acquainted with grief. Someone who knew what it meant to be rejected, misunderstood, and abandoned. Jesus did not suffer as a detached observer. He entered the full human experience. He was betrayed by a close friend, denied by one of his strongest supporters, abandoned by those who promised loyalty. False witnesses spoke against him. Crowds turned on him. Those who once praised him demanded his death. Even on the cross, he felt the weight of separation. This matters. It means no pain is foreign to God. When someone asks, "Does God understand what I'm going through?" Isaiah 53 answers without hesitation. Yes, not from a distance, but from inside the suffering itself. This is why the chapter has brought comfort where explanations fail. It tells the abused that injustice has been seen. It tells the accused that silence does not equal guilt. It tells the broken that weakness is not disqualification. Isaiah writes that the servant was despised and rejected yet chosen. His suffering was not proof of God's absence. It was the path of God's purpose. That truth reframes personal pain. Suffering is not always punishment. Pain is not always evidence of failure. Loss is not always the end of the story. This does not romanticize suffering. Isaiah does not soften it. He calls it crushing, wounding, heavy, real. But he also shows that suffering can be carried, not wasted. For those burdened by guilt, Isaiah 53 offers something even more personal. He bore our iniquities. The Lord laid on him the iniquity of us all. Guilt isolates. It whispers that forgiveness has limits, that some failures are too deep, too repeated, too shameful. Isaiah destroys that lie. If the servant bore all iniquity, then there is no category left uncovered, no secret sin unaccounted for, no past mistake too heavy. This does not excuse wrongdoing. It addresses it. Judgment was not ignored. It was absorbed. This gives believers a different way to face themselves. They no longer need to deny their flaws or hide their failures. They can name them honestly because the consequences have already been carried. That honesty becomes healing. Isaiah says, "By his wounds we are healed." Not merely physically, but internally. The healing of conscience, the quieting of accusation, the restoration of peace with God. Peter later echoed this, telling believers to follow Christ's example in suffering not by retaliation but by trust. Jesus did not respond to injustice with revenge. He entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. That posture changes how people endure hardship. They no longer need to settle every score. They no longer need to defend their worth. They can endure pain without being defined by it. Isaiah 53 also reshapes identity. Instead of seeing oneself primarily as a sinner, trying to improve, believers see themselves as forgiven people learning to live in freedom. Instead of measuring worth by performance, they measure it by what was paid for them. That creates stability, especially in seasons of failure. When someone stumbles, Isaiah 53 does not collapse. It stands. The foundation is not human consistency. It is the servant's finished work. This is why the chapter continues to meet people at their lowest points. It does not promise escape from suffering. It promises presence within it and purpose beyond it. The servant suffered not to eliminate all pain immediately, but to ensure pain would never have the final word. And for those who trust him, that changes everything. Isaiah 53 does not end in defeat. It ends in triumph that looks nothing like triumph. After describing suffering, rejection, and death, the chapter turns. Quietly, almost unexpectedly. The servant who was crushed does not remain in the grave. The one who was cut off sees life again. He will see his offspring. He will prolong his days. The will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. These are not the words of failure. They are the language of completion. Centuries later, as Jesus hung on the cross, he spoke 3 words that echoed Isaiah's conclusion. It is finished. Not I am finished. Not this is over, but it is finished. The work was complete. The payment described in Isaiah 53 had been fully made. Nothing remained outstanding. No additional sacrifice required. No further suffering necessary to secure forgiveness. This is where Christianity makes its most radical claim. Salvation is not a process to be perfected. It is a gift to be received. Isaiah says the servant will justify many. Justification is not gradual improvement. It is a declaration, a legal verdict. To be declared right not because one is perfect, but because another stood in their place. That verdict does not weaken over time. It does not expire when someone fails. It stands because it rests on the servant's obedience, not human performance. But Isaiah goes further. The servant does not merely complete his suffering, he continues his work. He makes intercession for the transgressors. This is not past tense. It is ongoing. The New Testament picks this up and pulls it into the present. Jesus is described as a living mediator, one who stands before God on behalf of those who trust him, not pleading uncertainty but presenting completed work. This changes how believers approach God. They do not come hoping their good days outweigh their bad ones. They come through a representative who has already been accepted. Prayer is no longer negotiation. Confession is no longer fear-driven. Worship is no longer performance. It becomes response. Isaiah 53 also reframes the meaning of victory. The servant's reward is not described as wealth or political power. His joy comes from seeing the results of his suffering. Lives restored, guilt removed, people reconciled to God. He will see the fruit of the travail of his soul and be satisfied. That word satisfied matters. It means nothing is missing, nothing incomplete, nothing left undone. For those who believe, this offers deep assurance. Doubt may rise, emotions may fluctuate, circumstances may shake faith, but Isaiah 53 anchors hope to something unchanging, the finished work of the servant. This also reshapes how believers view death. If the servant passed through death and emerged victorious, then death itself has been redefined. It is no longer the final enemy, it is a defeated one. Isaiah does not describe resurrection in technical detail, but the implication is unavoidable. The servant lives after death. He acts, he intercedes, he reigns. The New Testament makes this explicit. Resurrection is not an appendix to the story. It is the confirmation that Isaiah 53 was true all along. And this has future implications. Isaiah's vision does not end with individual salvation. It points toward restoration, justice, renewal. The servant's suffering secures peace not only internally, but ultimately cosmically. A world put right, a creation freed from decay, a future where suffering no longer needs explanation. This hope does not deny present pain. It gives it an expiration date. For believers, suffering becomes temporary, glory becomes permanent. That does not make waiting easy, but it makes it meaningful. Isaiah 53 stands as a bridge between promise and fulfillment, between ancient prophecy and living hope, between suffering and satisfaction. It declares that the cost has been paid, the work completed, and the future secured. The servant is no longer silent. He is no longer crushed. He is alive and still working. And that means the story is not over. At some point, Isaiah 53 stops being history. It stops being theology. It becomes personal, because this chapter does not simply present information. It asks a question quietly, relentlessly, without apology. What will you do with the servant? Isaiah opens the chapter with a startling confession. Who has believed our message? Not everyone would, not everyone does. The problem was never a lack of clarity, it was willingness. The servant does not arrive with the signs people expect. No outward beauty, no political dominance, no immediate rescue from oppression. He comes low suffering and unimpressive by worldly standards. And that alone disqualifies him for many. People want a God who confirms their expectations, not one who challenges them. A Savior who empowers their strength, not one who exposes their weakness. Isaiah 53 confronts that desire head-on. It presents a Messiah who wins by losing, who conquers through surrender, who saves by suffering. Accepting that requires humility. It means admitting that human effort is insufficient, that moral improvement is not enough, that no amount of religion, knowledge, or sincerity can bridge the gap sin creates. For many, that is the hardest truth to accept, because it means salvation is not earned, it is received. Isaiah describes the servant as despised and rejected by men. That rejection did not end in the first century. It continues wherever people are confronted with grace that costs them control. Some reject the servant because they do not think they need him. Others because they fear what surrender might demand. Others because the idea of substitution feels unfair. But Isaiah does not apologize for the message. He explains it. All we like sheep have gone astray. This is not targeted at a specific group. It is universal. Moral people and immoral people alike, religious and secular, educated and uneducated. Everyone strays. And instead of demanding everyone find their way back, God sends someone to go after them. The servant does not wait for worthiness. He steps into rebellion and bears its cost. That offends pride. It also heals shame. Those who feel unworthy often assume they are excluded. Isaiah 53 says the opposite. The servant came because of unworthiness, not despite it. The chapter leaves no room for partial acceptance. One cannot admire the servant as a moral example while ignoring his role as substitute. One cannot respect his teaching while dismissing his suffering as unnecessary. Isaiah presents a whole figure or none at all. This is why responses to Jesus tend to be extreme. Neutrality rarely lasts. The servant demands a verdict. The New Testament writers understood this tension. They did not market Jesus as an upgrade to life. They proclaimed him as the dividing line. Either he bore sin or everyone still bears their own. Either his sacrifice is sufficient or humanity remains indebted. Either grace is real or effort is all that remains. Isaiah 53 forces the issue. Belief in this chapter is not intellectual agreement. It is trust. Trust that the servant truly carried what he claimed to carry. Trust that nothing remains to be paid. Unbelief, likewise, is not mere doubt. It is the decision to carry the burden alone. The chapter ends with the servant receiving honor from God, not because people applauded him, but because he was faithful unto death. That is the final reversal. The one rejected on earth is vindicated in heaven. The one judged by humanity is justified by God. And now the reader stands where ancient Israel once stood, where the first disciples stood, where countless individuals have stood across centuries. Before the same question, is Isaiah 53 describing someone else, or is it describing the one who stands at the center of history? The chapter does not chase the reader. It waits, but it does not fade. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once heard, it cannot be ignored. Every reading leads to a response, and that response shapes everything that follows. Isaiah 53 never raises its voice. It does not threaten. It does not coerce. Its power lies in its restraint. After laying out suffering, substitution, victory, and vindication, the chapter does something unexpected. It steps back. It allows space. Space for reflection. Space for conscience. Space for choice. This is not the language of propaganda. It is the language of invitation. The servant does not force belief. He absorbs rejection. He does not crush resistance. He endures it. That alone reveals the heart behind the message. God is not interested in compliance without trust. He seeks response, not submission driven by fear. Isaiah 53 respects human freedom so much that it allows the possibility of refusal. That makes belief meaningful. In a world of noise, outrage, and persuasion, this quiet call stands apart. It does not demand instant transformation. It offers rest. Peace through punishment would have been a terrifying message. Isaiah offers something different, peace through sacrifice. The servant carries what others cannot, so they no longer have to. This is why many encounter Isaiah 53, not in moments of strength, but in moments of exhaustion, when striving has failed, when self-improvement has collapsed, when answers feel thin. The chapter does not say try harder. It says look closer. Look at the one who was wounded, not for his own wrongdoing, but for others. Look at the silence before accusers. Look at the surrender that was not weakness, but obedience. And then ask an honest question. If this is true, what does it change? It changes how one sees God, not as distant or indifferent, but as willing to enter suffering, not demanding blood, but offering himself. It changes how one sees others, not as competitors or threats, but as fellow wanderers in need of grace. It changes how one sees oneself, not as a project to fix, but as someone already loved at great cost. This is not moral laziness. Grace does not remove responsibility, it reorders it. Obedience becomes gratitude, not fear. Ethics become response, not leverage. Isaiah 53 does not end law, it fulfills it. For some, this call feels too gentle. They want certainty, rules, clear lines, measurable progress. But the servant offers something deeper. Relationship. A relationship built not on performance, but on trust. That trust grows slowly, quietly, often unnoticed at first. It does not explode at roots. Isaiah's servant does not demand dramatic gestures. He invites honest surrender, the kind that says, I cannot carry this alone anymore. And that surrender is not loss, it is release. The burden of proving worth, the fear of failing again, the weight of unresolved guilt, all transferred. This is why Isaiah 53 continues to speak across cultures, centuries, and belief systems. It addresses the universal human condition, the desire to be clean, whole, and accepted without pretending we already are. The chapter leaves room for questions. It does not rush belief. It respects the process, but it does not disappear. Like a quiet voice that returns in stillness, Isaiah 53 waits for the moment when noise fades and honesty remains. And when that moment comes, the servant stands ready, not to condemn, but to receive. No pressure, no manipulation. Just truth offered in love. The call is simple but not shallow. Trust what has been done. Receive what has been given. Rest where the work is finished. Isaiah 53 ends without applause. No celebration scene. No crowd finally realizing what they missed. Just a servant, vindicated by God. And perhaps that is the most powerful ending of all. Because the chapter was never written to impress the crowd. It was written to reach the heart. Centuries have passed since these words were first spoken. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have changed. Borders have been redrawn. Yet Isaiah 53 remains unchanged, undiluted, unsettlingly clear. It does not age because human need does not age. People still wrestle with guilt, still ache under suffering, still wonder whether God is distant or near, still ask if forgiveness is real or symbolic, still hope that pain is not meaningless. Isaiah 53 does not offer easy answers. It offers a person, a servant who does not shout from the heavens but bleeds on the earth, a savior who does not bypass suffering but walks straight through it, a victory that does not look like victory until it is complete. The chapter invites the reader to slow down, to sit with discomfort, to consider the possibility that the greatest act of power in history looked like weakness at the time. And that possibility changes how one sees everything. If God chose to save the world this way, then love is deeper than force, mercy stronger than judgment, sacrifice more powerful than control. Isaiah 53 does not argue this, it shows it. The servant does not explain himself. He gives himself, and in doing so, he redefines what it means to be right with God. Not climbing upward, but being lifted. Not proving worth, but receiving it. Not hiding failure, but trusting it has been dealt with. This is why the chapter continues to divide opinion and unite hearts. Some read it and see poetry. Others see prophecy. Others see controversy. But many quietly, privately see hope. Hope that guilt does not have the final word. Hope that suffering is seen. Hope that forgiveness is not fragile. Hope that death itself is not the end. Isaiah 53 does not end the story. It points beyond itself to a living reality that continues to change lives. The servant is no longer on the page alone. He is encountered in moments of surrender, in prayers whispered when no one is listening, in tears that finally fall without shame. And once encountered, he cannot be reduced to theory. He becomes personal. This is not a call to religion. It is an invitation to trust. Not blind trust, but informed, costly, honest trust. The kind that says, if this is true, I don't have to carry everything anymore. And that is where real transformation begins. Quietly, gently, lastingly. If this story stirred something in you, if Isaiah 53 raised questions or offered comfort or challenged assumptions, don't let the moment pass unnoticed. These are the kinds of questions worth sitting with. On this channel, we explore the Bible not as distant history, but as a living narrative, one that continues to shape lives, cultures, and hearts across the world. If you want to keep exploring these stories with depth, honesty, and clarity, consider subscribing. Join a growing community of viewers who aren't afraid to slow down, ask hard questions, and seek meaning beyond the surface. New videos dive into ancient texts, hidden connections, and the timeless truths that still speak today. Because some chapters were never meant to be skimmed. They were meant to be encountered. And Isaiah 53 is one of them. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay thoughtful, and we'll see you in the next story.